Yeah, that seems like a good place to stop. Okay, so the next section we're going to go to is about revelation and scripture. So he mentions how scripture has typically been understood as special revelation from God. But he said this immediately is going to make the question come up of if scriptures should count as divine revelation. And he says that's really going to depend on what you mean by the term revelation. Because you might say that scriptures are important for determining Christian doctrine, but that maybe they shouldn't be counted as divine revelation. But that depends on what you mean by revelation. So then that's what he gets into with the first section. So the question gets asked, is divine revelation, it can be one of three things. It could be either an act, it can be content, or it can be an experience. So with an act, revelation would be that God reveals something. With content, revelation would be the actual material that God reveals, and as an experience, it would be the recipient actually receiving the revelation. So I could use the example that as an act, I could say an act of revelation would be that I revealed to my wife that we're buying a new puppy. That would be the act, me actually doing that and communicating that to her. But you could also say that the revelation is what I reveal, and so I communicated to her the revelation that I'm buying a puppy. Or as an experience, you could say that my wife had the revelation that her husband told her that we're buying a puppy. So those are the three different ways that you can think of the term revelation to refer to different things. And so in the chapter, he gives a couple examples of different individuals that would hold to these specific definitions for revelation. Maybe it would be representative of that. So the first example that he gives is Herman Bavinck, Dutch theologian, 1854 to 1921. I listened a little bit about Herman Bavinck and said that he was a really brilliant thinker. He was really concerned with applying Christian doctrine to the issues of his day, of what it actually meant, how it was relevant to the issues that were going on. That he didn't have the idea that there was a golden age of Christianity where people were smarter or greater thinkers, but that there's always an opportunity for Christian doctrine to be applied in new ways and how it's relevant to Christians that are living for Jesus in their time. So on the topic of revelation, the book quotes him as saying that deliberate and free act of God by which he makes himself known to human beings in order that by it they may come to stand in the right relation to him. So Bavinck is definitely a representative of someone who sees revelation as the actual act of God communicating things to man. So then the next example he gives is for revelation as content. And a representative of this would be Richard Swinburne, professor of philosophy from the University of Oxford. I looked up and found an interview of Swinburne talking about revelation, and he talked about the things that we would need to be able to know the important things about God and what he's done and about his relationship with us. And he does say in there that this is paraphrased a little bit because it was an interview, but concerning his nature, what he's done for us, and what he commands us to do, we do need a revelation. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the sort of access and interaction with him. So here he's definitely talking about revelation as the thing that God gives us so that we can know him. So the actual content that God would give us so that we can understand who he is. And then the third example is a representative for the idea that revelation is an experience. And so there's George Mavrodes, who is a professor emeritus of philosophy at the University of Michigan, and he's got a couple quotes here. He says, "A species of experience, a conscious and at least partly cognitive encounter with an entity external to the self." That's how George Mavrodes would describe revelation. He says, "If I'm correct in thinking that revelation is a sort of experience, then the appropriate substitutions for N which is the individual having a relationship in this formula. And the appropriate substitutions for N must refer to individuals that are capable of having experiences. This would require, I suppose, that they be entities that are capable of consciousness and cognition. So again, in these quotes, he's definitely looking at revelation as the experience, as the actual receiving of this material, and how I experience it as a conscious person who's receiving this. So one of the problems that gets brought up is if you understand revelation as just some subset of these three things, then you can have problems that arise. So, for example, if you were to understand revelation as either being the act of God revealing or the experience of me having it revealed, if you were to take one of those, but you excluded the idea of revelation as being the actual material that's revealed, the content, then you would run into a problem where the Bible or Scripture would not be God's revelation. And that's an odd position to be in. But you would be in that spot. You wouldn't be able to say that Scripture is God's revelation, because Scripture, the actual text, is not an act that's happening, and it's not an experience that I'm having. Like, it is the content. So we could turn to look at what Scripture says on the topic, and how Scripture does have verses that talk about revelation in all three senses of the word. So there's places where the Bible talks about it being experiences. So you've got like 2 Corinthians, where Paul is talking about the person who was caught up to heaven, which maybe that was Paul, or maybe he's talking about somebody else. But that person's caught up, he'll proceed to tell about the visions and revelations of the Lord. Then this person is caught up to heaven, and he doesn't want to boast because of the extraordinary degree of the revelations. So again, this is a vision or an experience, something that's actually happening to the person. In Galatians, talks about a vision or a revelation that prompted Paul to go to Jerusalem. And then in Ephesians 3, you have Paul writing to the Ephesian church, and he's talking about the mystery that was made known to him. And this is the mystery about the Gentiles being fellow heirs of God. So he says, according to revelation, the mystery was made known to me. So again, this is an experience of Paul having this made known to him so that he can understand it. You've also got other places, so like for content, talking about revelation as the actual material that's relayed. You got 1 Corinthians, where Paul talks about speaking with a revelation, or with knowledge or prophecy or teaching. So this is some content that's being given. And then later in this chapter, he says, whenever you come together, each one of you has a psalm, has a teaching, has a revelation, a tongue, an interpretation. All things must be done for edification. So again, content that you have that you want to share with the church. In Revelation, it's talked about this way. Then revelation is the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to show these things. And he talks kind of throughout Revelation of like, write this down, take note of that. And it's because it's this letter being put together, the actual content that needs to be shared with the churches. Then you also have instances of revelation being an act. So you've got like Romans 8, where it talks about the revelation of the sons of God. And in context, this is the revealing of who belongs to God at the end of the age. Also, 1 Peter talks about praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And then some verses later, put your hope completely in the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So again, this is when Christ comes. This is his parousia, when he's revealed. So the Bible clearly talks about revelation in all three of these senses. We should understand that there are different senses of the word revelation, and so that's important. but all three of them are used. So we can't say that just one sense is revelation or another sense is not revelation. But we do want to be clear in what we're talking about. And so if we're going to talk about revelation and be clear, like which sense do we mean it in, it would be helpful to have some more specific terms defined. So in the book here, he talks about using the terms subjective revelation and objective revelation. So with the terminology subjective revelation and objective revelation, subjective revelation would be any experiential understanding of revelation. So if I'm going to say that this is an experience, this is something that I've had revealed to me, that would be experiential, whereas non-experiential is what the objective revelation is. So the example gets given of 2 Kings 22. There's the book of the law, and the book of the law is hidden in the wall of the temple, until it's finally discovered, and then the people read it, and then they have a revelation that this book is something that they didn't know about, that they didn't know these things that were written in here. There's consequences to that, and the book says things about how their lives should look. So you could say that the book of the law, even while it was hidden and it was still like within the wall of the temple, that it was God's revelation, that it was his content, it was objective revelation, even though during that time it wasn't being given, because it had been given long ago, and it wasn't being experienced actively, because there was no one reading it since it was hidden. But it was still objective revelation from God. Now, once they discover it and then they actually read it, then you could say that that's subjective revelation, where they're actually experiencing it. It is having an impact on their lives and changing them. So these would be two different ways that we can kind of classify or give some terms to these different senses of the word revelation for what we actually mean. And even with these terms, if you're going to say that, like, oh, no, only one of those is revelation, like only objective revelation should be called revelation, then, okay, that's fine. But there are verses that talk about revelation in all of these senses. So if you're going to say that that's only revelation, then, again, you just need a different term for what is the subjective sort of sense of things. And if you want to call that something other than revelation, you still need a term for that. But even if you give one sense of revelation a different term, you're still going to have all the same questions come up about, like, is this inspired, is it authoritative, is it truthful, and you still need to answer and address all of those things.